Welcome to ASEAN People Speak, Season 5. I'm Regine Jessica Abuel, your host for this podcast. For our third episode, we will take a closer look at Myanmar's conflict, its background, the current situation, and how ASEAN has responded. We are joined by an active promoter of human rights in Burma, business and human rights, atrocity prevention, and women's leadership. Our speaker has worked in media, academia, government, and human rights organizations across Malaysia, Australia, and Thailand. She served as Secretary-General of International Federation for Human Rights, or FIDH, from 2013 to 2019, and currently chairs the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or ESCRNet, the International Campaign for Rohingya, and Innovation for Change. She also sits at the board of AWID, continuing to champion human rights through global networks and local communities. Everyone, let us all welcome our guest for this third episode of the fifth season, Miss Debbie Stothard. Hello, Miss Debbie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yes, and thank you for saying yes to us. We are so glad that you can join us for this episode of the fifth season of ASEAN People Speak. We're so happy that you are with us. How are you today?
Oh, it's a busy time of the year, but congratulations on the fifth season. This is exciting and really glad to hear that people are still concerned about ASEAN and want to know about it.
Yes, definitely. And this is a very good way actually to let the youth also, and a lot of people who are just interested, not literally not really in like law or certain social or political organizations, but for also students or some people who are just interested in ASEAN topics, just like what we are going to talk about today. So I know it might be quite heavy for our listeners today, but we will surely learn a lot from you today as we talk about Myanmar's civil war and the ASEAN's dilemma. So to start it off, I just want to ask to give us a little background. Can you give us an overview of the conflict? Maybe you can also give us a little bit of history and how the ongoing civil war in Myanmar has come about.
Well, firstly, we need to recognize that Burma, Myanmar was one of the first ASEAN countries to gain independence in 1948 and from the British. It was a civilian democratic government until a military coup in 1962. Now, what's happened since then is that it's a very rich and diverse country, and the different ethnic groups have been targeted by the military. So many of these different ethnic groups wanted to have the ability to have a political voice in the country, and they wanted to be held equally. But the military has the various military regimes of the country have tried to subjugate local people, and it's a little bit like what's been happening in southern Philippines, for example, where the central government, a military-led government, has actually been in a state of war against one or more ethnic groups in any given time since 1962. And very brutally, the military doesn't just attack armed resistance. They actually have a deliberate strategy of attacking civilians in that area, and also using rape and sexual violence mainly against women and children in the ethnic nationality areas to terrorize them. So we need to understand this backdrop. And in the midst of this, the Rohingya community was amongst one of the most persecuted. So when pressure from ASEAN and international sanctions were laid onto the military in the most, well, not the most recent, but the previous military regime, we saw that there was enough pressure for the military to create a roadmap to a civilian rule. So we had actually um, a military, a quasi civilian system between 2011 and 2021, where there was a kind of a power sharing between civilian parties, democratic parties such as the National League for Democracy, and the military, a kind of a blended government, if you will. But in November 2020, there was a general election. So what we saw was in November 2015, there was a general election. Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the NLD, won by a landslide, as well as other ethnic parties won quite a lot of seats in the parliament. And then in 2020, November, there was another landslide victory where the military party won less than 10% of parliamentary seats. So the commander in chief, Min Aung Hlaing, who was scheduled to retire and therefore lose completely his power and influence in 2021, pressured Aung San Suu Kyi, who was supposed to form the new government, to make him president. And when she refused, they enacted a coup. And that has led to some of the worst violence ever in Burma, Myanmar. And I would say that as an oldie who's been involved in the movement since 1988, we've seen military brutality and crackdowns in the country before, but we haven't seen it to this extent because we've had nearly 30,000 people arrested and jailed arbitrarily. We've had people executed in jail. And since the coup started in February 2021, we've had 58,000 incidents of armed clashes and attacks on civilians, including thousands of airstrikes targeting civilians. What this means is that every month we have more than 1,000 incidents of military violence, including airstrikes, mainly targeting schools and hospitals and camps of internally displaced people. So it is that huge problem that we're seeing. And the military junta has recently reshaped itself. It's actually gotten rid of most of the civilian members of the military junta. So there's out of the 10 member junta, there's 9 of them are serving or retired military. There's only one civilian on there, and they have actually brought in more restrictive laws and more militarization because they're preparing for a sham election in December when everyone's having Christmas holidays or end of New Year holidays. They're actually going to start a sham election. Which is only going to be carried out in about 40% of the country to legitimize themselves. And in this election, they've actually outlawed the parties that won over 90% of parliamentary seats in the last 2 elections in the country's history. So they've stacked everything into their own in their own favor. And if people criticize this election in public, they can go to jail automatically for 3 years. And that's what happened recently to a young man who questioned the election on social media. So it is both a very tense and challenging, but also very interesting time to be looking at what's happening in Myanmar, Burma. And I know people saying, okay, this is depressing. What the heck
It is
are we
quite
going to
depressing
do?
to hear. Yes.
But one of the things we have to understand is that young people have been at the forefront. Young people and women have been at the forefront of this movement. They're very defiant. They're still doing flash mobs. They're still doing advocacy. They're still doing human rights documentation. They're doing a lot of activism despite all the challenges and despite all the dangers. And that's why I remain optimistic, even though the odds seem to be stacked against us.
Yeah, actually, I was going to, if we can circle back on what you said, that was 1,000 incidents of military violence monthly. We're not talking about like in a year span, but just monthly. So we can just imagine the chaos and a lot of, civilians being in the middle of all this fight. And it has been very disturbing because aside from, of course, the things that you have mentioned, we're talking about death and civilian casualties who are definitely not involved in this political this war, but they are caught in between of everything. And maybe also I would like us to touch on the issue of the large scale displacement as well. So you've mentioned a while ago that there have been a lot of refugees or asylum seekers because of that. Maybe we can also you can also tell us more about these things. And aside from also the women and the children that have been suffering from this very chaotic times.
Well, Regine, the UN says that there's about 3.3 million people who have been forcibly displaced because of
23.
military violence.
That's a lot.
But human rights documenters on the ground, people in the community, say they calculate that it's more than
More.
5 million. So we're
Oh.
looking at 10% of the population being displaced in the country.
Mhm.
But we believe there are millions more who were able to afford to leave the country to seek asylum or to get jobs or to sign up for education courses overseas, because it's been incredibly difficult for young people to continue their education. And so we don't really know for sure how exactly how many people are technically refugees from Burma, seeking asylum in other parts of the region,
Mhm.
mainly because ASEAN governments and ASEAN countries refuse to cooperate with the UNHCR, or have not refused to sign the Refugee Convention. So many asylum seekers and refugees are considered illegal migrants or displaced people, but they're not acknowledged as refugees with rights to asylum. So we don't know for sure how many people have been able to leave the country, but we know that it's not only civilians who are leaving the country. In July, the military junta sent out an order commanding, at the moment, if you work for the so-called public service or civil administration under the military, you are not allowed to leave the country without permission. But now in July, the military has actually commanded that if you are the children or a child or a spouse of a civil servant, you cannot leave the country without military permission. And
Oh.
that's because there are, in February 2024, the military was losing soldiers. Many soldiers were defecting to the resistance because they were really unhappy
Yeah.
and disgusted with the crimes that they were being ordered to commit.
Yeah.
And also the resistance was killing soldiers from the junta. They were fighting back for the. I think it's really important to note that this is in since 2021 we've seen a very strong resistance, including young people fighting back because ASEAN and the international community didn't protect peaceful protesters. People were being shot in the street. People were being dragged off to jail and tortured to death. So we saw that young people saying, some of them saying, I'm giving up the unarmed resistance. I'm going to join the armed resistance to fight back because nobody else is going to protect us. So now
Oh.
we have the military junta then in February 2024, desperate to increase the size of its army and also desperate to suppress young people, started to activate a law
Yeah.
that forcibly conscripts men and women from age 18 to 35.
Mhm.
So we are seeing ASEAN countries like Thailand and Malaysia still deporting asylum seekers from Burma into the hands of the military, and these young people are being forced to join the army and sent to the front line with minimum training. In July, for example, the Ranong Immigration Detention Center in southern Thailand handed over 162 young people. They deported them into the hands of the military junta in Burma. And out of the 162 people, 150 were immediately sent to the army and forcibly conscripted. So ASEAN adopted a 5-point consensus in
Mhm.
April 2021, mainly focused on reducing conflict, but ASEAN countries themselves are actually feeding the conflict by sending people back to the junta who are forcibly conscripted into the army.
Well, actually, you've presented a very, very comprehensive way of how ASEAN has actually reacted to the to this war, to this civil war, and we've seen, based on what you said, that there are certain countries. It seems that ASEAN is very much divided. You've mentioned that Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand have leaned towards the engagement because they have been deporting certain deporting persons coming to their country, going back to Myanmar. But on the other hand, we have other states like Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore and Philippines that are pushing for stronger measures and who continue to exclude junta leaders in their countries. But then you've mentioned about the 5 point consensus. May I just ask also what your opinion on it is? Do you think this is a very good mechanism to at least address the problem, or there is still a lot of things to be done?
Well, firstly, I want to say that although Malaysia is technically on the side of the in the side that part of ASEAN membership that is pressuring the junta diplomatically,
Mhm.
Malaysia is still deporting Burmese people back into the
Mm.
hands of the military and who are forcibly conscripted. So we have on one side Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the other side, as you said, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Philippines. But we also have a big division within ASEAN because some of those countries would rather go back to business as usual, and they really don't support. They actively discourage multi-party democracy, and
Mm.
they actively violate human rights. So they would rather not. They would rather protect the junta because they don't want that for
Mm.
themselves, because they
Mhm.
themselves will be put under scrutiny. So that's
Yeah.
one thing. But
Mhm.
when we look at the 5-point consensus, a lot of it is oriented towards reducing conflict and trying to deal with the humanitarian crisis and trying to create a dialogue. Now, more even some ASEAN governments themselves would privately admit that the 5-point consensus is dead in the water. There hasn't been sufficient political will or unity to implement this very mild 5-point consensus, because one of the things the 5-point consensus doesn't say is doesn't call for the immediate and unconditional release of political prisoners, which is now close to 30,000 people. So there's at least 23,000 people still in jail. 23,000. I remember about 25 years ago, the number of political prisoners hit 3,000, and we were
Yeah.
screaming murder. This is huge. So
Yes.
anyway, what we see now is that ASEAN is reluctant to update or review the 5 point consensus because ASEAN has split since then. That
Mm.
April 2021, the 5 point consensus was the only point in time that all ASEAN countries agreed
I
on Myanmar.
see.
So I think there is an existential threat to ASEAN. If ASEAN has come out with ASEAN 2045, our shared future, a blueprint for the region for the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks good when you read it. There's some progressive language in there, but it doesn't reflect the reality within ASEAN on the ground or the lack of agreement between ASEAN leadership. So I think we are we cannot depend on ASEAN to solve the problem. We have
Yes.
to depend on ourselves in terms of solidarity, young people's movements, human rights movements, women movements all around the region to really stand up and do the advocacy and pressure individual governments
Mm-hmm.
to change. Because ASEAN as a body is still hugely disunited, and it's really sad because if we compare, economically,
Mm-hmm.
Singapore's GDP per capita at purchasing power parity is 1.5 times the US, almost 2 times. And even the poorest country in ASEAN is still 3 times richer than the poorest country in Africa. So when we were comparing all the different regional mechanisms, we saw that ASEAN is actually only 10 members. The Organization of American States is more than 30. African Union is more than 50. And yet, despite this huge diversity, despite the fact that these regions are actually economically behind ASEAN, their human rights protection and their conflict resolution mechanism is much more robust. Whereas in ASEAN, we are still very far behind. And this is unfortunately the reason Myanmar cannot depend on ASEAN governments at this stage to change the situation. And ASEAN governments themselves are not being very practical because what's been happening in Burma, Myanmar is as a destabilizing and a threat to regional stability economically, in terms of human security, in terms of social, cultural, and economic terms. So, if we want to talk about this, um, let's just not forget. In the past 4 years, since the coup started, the price of rice in Myanmar has increased by 400%.
Wow, that's
And the
outrageous.
price of
Four
fuel
hundred percent is very huge.
and the price of fuel has increased by 400%. And the military has been bombing and cause launching airstrikes and artillery attacks on some of the important agricultural areas. So the military itself is using all its revenues to buy bombs and fighter jets and bullets
Military
to
equipment.
destroy
Yeah,
the economy.
yeah.
And then they are squeezing money out of people and with all kinds of arbitrary taxes. So many families are actually depending on migrant on family members who are overseas, working overseas, to keep them alive. So we have to understand that the military is increasingly violent because it's losing the war.
Yeah.
And
And they are
ASEAN,
doing everything they can so that they'll
yes,
be able to sustain the power.
absolutely. So when Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos go and help the military junta and try to protect them from pressure, and trying to reduce the pressure within ASEAN, they're actually worsening the situation and prolonging the war.
Well, that is very heavy, but actually, we want to thank you, Debbie, for giving us that very, very nice way to see how things are interplayed, how everything is connected. It's not just about political views, but also a lot of things that, and a lot of human rights violations, but it also trickles down also to as simple as the agricultural economy of Myanmar, and where resources are being concentrated to, instead of the people, it's being concentrated to the military and supporting the military so that they will be able to sustain their power. Thank you so much for discussing the Myanmar civil war with us during this episode. And maybe just a few words, Debbie, before we end this episode. I know it's quite heavy for our listeners, but I would like to note, though, that what you mentioned a while ago, that there is still hope and that you're not giving up, because a lot of other factors, especially civil society groups, organizations, the youth, women, and women, um, some non-government organizations as well, are pushing for advocacies for changes in Myanmar. And if it cannot be done in the ASEAN level, then it can somehow, we hope that it can be done in the state level.
Young people are working very hard to even draft state constitutions. They are contributing to state
Mhm.
constitutions. They have been drafting an inclusive federal economic policy, drafting economic policies for the future, because they are sure that at no other point in time of Myanmar's history that we are in have the strongest possible chance to win and to reverse this coup. So I think all of us need to really pressure our ASEAN governments. If they cannot push for change of the junta, if they cannot pressure the junta, they should at least step out of the way and
Yeah.
let the movement get on with its job.
Yes, indeed. And I agree with you. I agree with you personally as well, Debbie. And well, on that note, we want to thank you so much, Debbie, for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. I'm sure our listeners were able to get a lot from our discussion. But before we end, would you like to promote any of your social media accounts, websites, organizations, or any publications or upcoming projects?
Well, we're hyperactive. We're doing a lot because young people are doing a lot from the
From the
Burma
ground
Myanmar
level?
movement.
Yes.
But at least come to our website www.altsEAN.org and download the monthly Coup Watch bulletins, because these actually give you an overview of what's been happening. These give you a summary of facts, and hopefully you can use that to support young people and the greater movement for democracy and human rights in Burma, Myanmar. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. And thank you, Debbie. And thank you to all our listeners for this very, very productive discussion. Join us again next week. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on Spotify to stay updated and never miss an episode. You can also stay connected with us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by following at WG ASEAN-HR-MEC. And for more in depth information, visit our website at aseanhrmec.org. Thank you very much, guys. We hope you learned a lot from today's episode. And until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Bye.